colonization.
The slave is the tiller of soil, the maker of sugar and brandy, the pack animal, the breaker and pulverizer of stones, the cook, the footman, groom, shoemaker, tailor, courier, and carrier. Van Eschwege, traveler.
Era o escravo que conduzia a cidade.
It was the slaves who ran the city. They were the traders, they were the population, everything. They even managed the city's waste.
Carregadores de excrementos. A cidade não tinha sistema de
Tigers were the slaves who carried excrement. The city didn't have sewers, and the excrement was thrown on the beaches.
jogavam nas praias. E tigre, justamente.
The name tiger has nothing to do with being virile. It has to do with the spots that showed up on the bodies of these slaves, who were kept prisoners in dungeons, from carrying this waste above their heads, with the acids dribbling down onto their skin.
Tanto levarem dejetos.
But what did the women do?
Eram quituteiras, eram as
They
aquelas que
cooked.
abasteciam
They supplied workplaces with food.
os lugares de trabalho. Então,
They sold sweets all over town, while always carrying their license plates around the neck. The ones in the center of the city, besides serving food, were used as prostitutes.
Servitudes, muitas eram utilizadas na prostituição.
Prostitutes found easy clients among the white settlers. The Portuguese were far from home and family, and the indigenous Indian women and black slave women were both targets for sexual liaison.
In the early days, Portugal was such a tiny country with only just over 1 million people, and setting out to colonize practically half the world or convert it. It was just crazy what they were trying to do. So their official instructions to people in the early years in Brazil were just to breed up as much as they could.
A colonização foi essencialmente masculina. A mulher portuguesa.
In Brazil, the colonization was essentially male. The Portuguese woman, the family, did not come to Brazil. You can count on one hand the number of European women, in contrast with the number of European men. So, the biological integration of the African woman with the European man was natural. There wasn't this ethnic exclusiveness that took place in the United States.
Étnico que aconteceu nos Estados Unidos.
The sharp distinction between white master and black slave began to blur in a country where white men, born either in Portugal or Brazil itself, had little choice but to mix with non-white women.
The Portuguese differ enormously from the British in the whole colonial enterprise. There were different forms of domination, whereas the British, at least towards the end of the 19th century, bitten by what was then called scientific racism, divided people up according to their supposed race and prohibited contact between them, and encouraged the development of racial communities. The Portuguese did not do this. I mean, they did to a certain extent, but much less. The British also fornicated, but they didn't recognize their children as such, whereas the Portuguese did, incorporated them, taught them to speak Portuguese, and I think that's the way they expanded.
The extent of sexual relations between master and slave led to thousands of mixed-race children. Some were made heirs. Most were made slaves. The dominant Catholic Church knew of such disparity but turned a blind eye. More than that, it jumped through legalistic hoops to make slavery itself not only acceptable, but justifiable as a way of spreading the faith. Indeed, slave owners were obliged by law to baptize all their workers. Hundreds of ornate churches were built to be used by whites and newly converted blacks. These churches were both built and decorated by slaves. Pointedly, some quietly rebelled by sculpting pregnant angels.
One very erudite Portuguese priest who was long resident in Brazil delivered in the 17th century a particularly revealing sermon in which he argued that the trials and tribulations in this life were sure passage to comfort and peace in the next, and that slaves could take consolation in that. He also warned masters that the other could be true, and if you were too abusive of your slaves, you might find passage to the next life a fairly uncomfortable one. So he wanted to have it both ways, but he certainly wasn't arguing against the existence of the institution of slavery. The Catholic Church never took up that campaign.
Black brothers, the slavery you suffer, however hard and grinding it may be, or seems to be, is only half slavery. You are slaves in your exterior part, which is the body. However, in the other interior and nobler half, the soul, you are not a slave, but free. When you serve your masters, you do not serve them as someone who serves men, but rather as someone who serves God. Vieira, Jesuit priest.
They are kept in a state of the darkest ignorance. They are baptized for form's sake, and no doubt actually worship the images of the saints as probably resembling their African gods. Cowper, British diplomat.
For many black slaves, life was lived on two levels. They were baptized and fed the Christianity and language of the white man, but Africa persisted in music, dance, and religion. Many slaves did not adhere wholly or at all to Catholicism. They fought hard to maintain their traditional beliefs, to follow their own saints. Slave masters could not prevent their workers from keeping this link to an African past. Some owners actually declared it helped to keep their slaves happy and diverted from the monotony of their labors. Music and dance became an inextricable part of a developing Brazilian identity.
The Negroes were dripping, and yet the musicians did not cease running from one to the other and exciting them still more. The dance had arrived at such a degree of strange overexcitement when suddenly calling was heard from the house. Let all fires be extinguished, that all noise ceases, and that all the Negroes return to their cabins. In dancing and singing, they forget their ills and servitude, and only remember their native country and the time that they were free. Toussaint Sanson, Planter's wife.
One of the outstanding differences between Brazil and the U.S. South is simply the fact that not only more slaves came to Brazil than to the U.S. South, but they continued to come for a longer period of time and later into the 19th century. So that there was a constant renewal of Africans and of African culture to Brazil. It was more reinforced and fresher in the Brazilian experience. And so they brought with them that cultural heritage. And it's ironic that today, some of that is better preserved in Brazil than it is in Africa, because change continued to happen in Africa to erode those forms.
Often I have sat at night upon the threshold of the door, and I have heard the whisperings in the Negro huts, and have observed some feast or merrymaking, thus late at night, thus concealed. Costa, English sugar planter.
The masters suffered in the sense that they had to face their slaves every day without knowing whether they would end up alive or dead. So there was a lot of tension all the time. It was not an easy thing to be a master either because of that. They would go to bed with the belief that he could be poisoned by their slaves. There would be a revolt. They were afraid when they heard slave drumming. They thought that they were preparing, something spiritual, diabolical. They believed that slaves had within their community powerful witches.
Late at night, in fields and woods, slaves performed animal sacrifices to their saints. And in an atmosphere of killing and blood, thoughts would turn to the pursuit of freedom. So large were the numbers of slaves in Brazil, and so inherently cruel the regime, that the Portuguese felt justifiably vulnerable. By the early 1800s, occasional revolts were occurring. Resistance varied. Some slaves broke machinery, others set fire to crops, some simply went on strike. One group in 1806 refused to work and made these demands.
If my lord also wants our peace, he must agree to the following. Friday and Saturday to work for ourselves. Give us casting nets and canoes. More flour. Reduce the daily quota of sugarcane we must cut. More men to cut the wood. Someone to tend the fire at the kettles. We shall be able to play, relax, and sing anytime we wish. Accepting all the above, we are ready to serve you as before.
Other slaves expressed their discontent by fleeing. But to where?
Slaves who ran away joined runaway communities called quilombos. And even cities, even the city of Rio de Janeiro was ringed by quilombos established in the forests, in the hills, quite nearby. And some of these became, had a long life that were more or less independent. They were always the object of police attempts to break them up.
I have ordered assaults against some of these quilombos with a police squad, along with soldiers of the militia, but all has been in vain. As long as they are carried out by ordinary soldiers, these attacks can never accomplish anything except to frighten the blacks and drive them away, because it is not practical for booted, uniformed, and armed men to penetrate into those steep, lofty mountain jungles and caves where the blacks hide out and move about with total freedom. De Rezende, police chief.
In the cities, too, the Portuguese saw an increased confidence among blacks that freedom was on its way. At times, this belief took an aggressive form. One of the traditions that slaves had sought to maintain was a martial art called capoeira. To avoid prohibition, it had been masked as a dance. But now, gangs of capoeiristas roamed the streets, using their skills to attack whites and the police. Tensions grew, and new restrictive legislation was enacted.
The games which the blacks play in the streets, plazas, and beaches are forbidden, under penalty of suffering from 12 to 36 lashes. Provincial law, City of Recife, 1833. Shouting after hours is forbidden in the streets of this town. Any violator, being a slave, will suffer 25 lashes. Provincial law, Town of Brejo, 1836.
Maintaining control of the slave population was becoming increasingly hard. But the need for slaves did not decline. By the 1800s, sugar and gold had been joined by tobacco and coffee as the key cash crops. Slave labor was as vital as ever. Depending on comparatively cheap human imports, slave owners were reluctant to embrace the European Industrial Revolution and its labor-saving technologies. In 1822, Brazil secured independence from Portugal. For slaves, little changed. But the international pressure for abolition grew, particularly from Britain.
Well, Britain played a very interesting role as far as the abolition of the slave trade in Brazil was concerned. It had, if you like, a dual role. On the one hand, the British government was extremely active in establishing an anti-slavery squadron which patrolled the Atlantic. At the same time, you could argue that British involvement, economic involvement in Brazil, actually perpetuated and assisted in continuing slavery in Brazil. Britain imported slave-produced sugar from Brazil, slave-produced coffee from Brazil, right until the end of the 19th century.
But an end was in sight. Some slaves were now offered limited freedoms.
I, Antonio Pereira Freitas, state that I possess a slave of more or less 9 years of age, which slave I liberate and possess in a liberated condition from this day forward forever, with the declaration that he serve me while I live, and that during this entire period of my life he not attempt to free himself by legal means, since he is already free as a result of this my decision. And if at some time he should disobey me, or show some ingratitude toward me, he will lose the freedom which I am granting him, and will remain subject to enslavement to my person and any heirs. Freitas, slave owner.
Offering conditional freedom was seen for what it was, a last gasp attempt to deflect abolition. During the 19th century, 1 million new slaves from throughout Western Africa arrived at Brazilian harbors. In Rio, the slaves outnumbered the rest of the population 2 to 1.
My hand shakes with indignation as I call the imperial government's attention to this trafficking. On sale are, for example, the services of Georgina, black, 1 year old, valued at 20 reais. The services of Orminda, a mulatta, 3 months old, and Leonidia, a few days old. Nabucco, abolitionist.
The continued British confiscation of slave ships and its restriction on trade meant that the transportation of Africans that had begun 350 years earlier would have to end. Within Brazil itself, larger and larger numbers of slaves were simply abandoning plantations, wrecking the whole system. Plantation owners decided to opt for abolition and hoped they could coerce some slaves to stay on. On the 13th of May, 1888, the Princess Regent Isabel proclaimed the so-called Aurea Law. Brazil became the last major country officially to abolish slavery.
True that this was the final Emancipation Act, but of course even after that, those who had formerly been slaves owe nothing, were given no compensation and so on, and so were forced to remain on the land or to exist in other ways. In other words, although they were legally free, they were still bound economically to the land, to the mines or the other occupations that they were forced to undertake.
The blacks are the ones in prisons, living in the slums, not having jobs. Nowadays, they're not slaves belonging to one master. They are slaves of the system. The executioner has changed. It's much more sophisticated. The whip is almost invisible, but it is still felt.
No country imported more slaves than Brazil. Even today, the majority of black people throughout the Americas speak Portuguese. Following abolition, there was a deliberate policy to draw in white settlers: Italians, Germans, Spaniards. But almost half of today's 170 million population remains non-white.
The legacy of slavery to modern Brazil is huge. Racial inequality, the fact that the majority of blacks are poor, that they are not as well educated as whites. But you also have positive results, not of slavery itself, but of the slaves. In terms of the music, in terms of the religion, made Brazilian culture much richer than it would have been without the presence of Africans in Brazil.
The heady mix of music, religion, dance, and sport can sometimes blur the less appealing legacies of slavery. Homelessness, street children, unemployment. A country built on sugar has left a bitter taste in the mouths of many.
Brazil looks like a colonial society, and the same elite continue to rule Brazil. And even though we now have a democratic constitution and liberal democracy and all the rest of it, the country continues to be dominated by a very small percentage of the population, mainly white. So in that